Alright, so we're going to begin just like last time with making a copy of our layer, a duplicate layer, so that we can work on that, and we'll turn the background layer off. So go to the quick selection tool, and we need to select the figure we want to work with. So you can set a reasonable size for the brush and then click and move around on your figure, and what will happen is the selection tool will automatically look for edges and differences in color and select all of those. So I'm going to move around the edges, and then I'm going to select her backpack on the ground here, and you can zoom in while you're making your selection to look for edges. If you're on Add, when you let go, you can click anywhere else and add new things to your selection without losing it. And if you click on Subtract down at the bottom there, you can use that to take things away if you get too much, or if you want to remove little holes like the gap in between her arms there. You don't have to get exact at this stage though, because we will be refining the selection afterwards. So get something that is pretty close. And I think this is looking pretty good. You can see we've got a few extra things in there. There's a gap in the fingers we'll have to cut out. And we've got a little bit of extra sky in a few places, but in general, that seems pretty good. So once you have the selection the way that you want it, we're then going to go up to the buttons above the Layers panel and click Add Layer Mask. Now what that does, you can see that it's added a black box there. That little box shows you what areas of the layer are transparent. Anything that shows up as black is now transparent, and anything that shows up as white is visible. So remember, black or darkness hides things. Now the great thing about a mask is that things are not erased permanently like they would be if you use the eraser tool. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Make sure that the layer mask is highlighted. See how there's a blue box around that? If you double click on the thumbnail, you get a blue box around that. Double click on the layer mask, you get a blue box around that. That tells you which one you're drawing on. So I'm currently drawing on the layer mask. I'm going to paint with white. Now see how I'm revealing the original picture there? You can see there's new white areas on that layer mask thumbnail. And by painting white, I'm allowing the picture to be seen. White shows things. If I paint black, it's all becoming transparent again. Black hides things. Imagine you accidentally erased part of your figure. If you were to delete this with the eraser tool, there'd be no way to get it back once you had saved the image. Whereas with the mask, the original image is always there. You can bring it back or hide it again as many times as you need. You can also easily hide a layer mask if you want to see the original image, and if you have messed up a layer mask, you can easily delete it. So now it's time to clean up our edges a little bit on this mask. We're going to create a new layer and fill that layer with black. It's often very hard to tell how good your edges are when you're on that checkerboard background. Things become a lot clearer on a pure white or pure black background. There's a little white spot there and a little hole in the chest that I missed. It gives you a good chance to see what the edges are like as well. So I can see there's a few areas that have not worked out terribly well. Some of the edges are very, very soft. There's some spots in her hair there that aren't quite right. So we're going to fix a few of those things. If you go up and click on the layer mask so that it's outlined in blue, you'll notice that your colors change immediately to black and white when you go to the brush tool. Anywhere that you paint with black will be hidden. Remember, black hides. And anywhere that you paint with white will be revealed. So you can actually manually paint over areas to make them either become visible or to become transparent. That's a good way to sharpen up edges and fix any little mistakes that were created in the selection. And because this is non-destructive, if you are adding or revealing parts and you reveal too much, you can just switch to black and hide the parts that you didn't plan on revealing. The shortcut X might be useful here because X flips your foreground and background colors, so you can immediately paint with white, just hit X and you're automatically then painting with black, which can really speed up your workflow. Now, you could continue to just work back and forth, painting directly on the layer mask, and sharpen up all the edges that way. But that would take a while, and it would be difficult in some areas like hair. Hair is notoriously hard to get good edges on. Luckily, there's another option. So what I'm going to get you to do is go up and right-click on the layer mask and choose Apply Mask to Selection. That gives us back our selection. You can see the marching ants. And then as long as you have a selection tool on, you can go down to Refine Edge. And that will bring up a window that gives you several options. The Refine Edge tool, I'll be honest, it's very tricky to use. It can be temperamental, and a lot of times it's not clear what is going to work for you. So I'm going to show you what I think is the easiest way to handle this and what some of the things do. You're free to experiment, but just be aware that this can be a frustrating tool. Even I don't always get it to do what I want it to do. When it first comes up, you're going to see the marching ants, what are called the marching ants, which is that selection around your figure. You have a few other options for how you're going to display it. You can display it with a red overlay that shows where the transparent areas are. You can show it on black like we had before, and you can show this, which looks very much like the layer mask. So that you have a lot of options here. I'll try to show you what some of them do and then what I think is the best method for this. So your different view options are at the top. I'm going to turn the marching ants back on. There is an option called Shift Edge, and what that does, if you slide it to the right, it basically expands your selection outward, and to the left it shrinks your selection inward. That can be useful. But for our purposes, we're going to go to the black and white option, so that looks a lot like the mask. The smoothing option here, you can see that as you move the smoothing option up, the edges get much, much rounder, but you're losing all the definition. So we're going to keep the smoothing super, super low. The contrast slider is the one we're going to be using the most. As you slide that to the right, you can see that around the edges, everything is getting sharper. There's no more fuzzy grays. Everything is either pure white or pure black. We don't want it all the way to the right because that creates too harsh an edge. But we're going to start with it somewhere around 40. And because it does tend to make the edges a little bit sharp, we'll set a smoothing value of maybe 2 or 3. A lot of this is going to be a balance between contrast and smoothing. And what we're trying to do is to get as sharp and accurate an edge as we can. Okay, so if you go up to this brush looking tool up here, this is a brush that will expand your selection. If you click and paint over top of areas of your selection, you can see how when you let go, it actually has gotten much closer to the edges. If you switch to your white and black, you can see that now there's a gap in the fingers there. This is especially useful around hair. So when you're painting on the white and black, your painting area appears as white, but you can see how when you let go, it's now detecting the edges of that hair. If you paint with it in this view mode, you can see the individual strands of hair being picked up. The more you paint over an area, so the longer you hold down and paint over top, the more accurately it picks out the edges. So I'm going to paint around the hair here, and that's going to bring out some more of the edges of the hair. I'm going to go over the face here, and just to make sure we get all the little details of the face. Anywhere where you think there might be little details that your original selection left out, particularly around hair, it's a good place to paint over. Now you switch back to the black and white. You'll notice that there are some little gray areas there. And anything that's gray in a layer mask is partially transparent. Now we don't really want anything to be partially transparent on her shoulder there. And you'll notice that if you lower the contrast, you'll see even more gray areas. So that's where you switch back to the little eraser looking tool, which removes things from your selection. So you can, any little gray areas or anywhere where it's kind of erased something you don't want, you can paint over that, and that will keep those areas from being transparent. The more you reduce the contrast, the more accurate edges you'll get, but the more of those transparent areas you'll get. So it's sort of a going back and forth, a little dance between getting good edges, but staying away from getting parts of your person to be transparent. I also like to jump back and forth between being able to see the person and being able to see the black and white, because on the black and white version you can pick out details like that line there, which you would never have seen in the other version. It would have been impossible to tell that was there. I can also see that this edge is a lot fuzzier than I thought. So it's good to go back and forth between view modes as you're working on refining those edges. One thing I learned from experience, don't hit the escape button while you're in this process, or the refine window will close and you'll lose all of the changes you've just done. Now I'm still not very happy with this hair area, so I'm going to go in and adjust some of my values. I can tell the hair is still being cut off there. So I think what's happening is, see with the selection you can tell there's little wisps of hair out there, but they're not fully selected. I'm going to reduce the smoothing from 2 down to 1 to see if that helps. I'm going into black and white mode. Yeah, you can see how there's a lot more detail there around the edge of the hair. So I'm going to paint over that again just to try to pick up some of those edges that might have been smoothed out by that smoothing value, just to get as many accurate details as we can. Remember, if you hold down space, you immediately get the hand tool, which lets you pan around. So I'm getting to the point now where I'm starting to be pretty happy with this selection. So I'm going to hit OK, and then we go back to our marching ants, but we're not done yet. You make sure you don't deselect this. We have to apply this to the layer mask still. So what we're going to do is right-click and go down to Fill Selection. And we're going to fill the figure with white, because remember, white reveals. So once you hit this, watch the hair. See how much hair just suddenly came in and it was visible? Because now the mask is showing that part of the hair. Then we're going to invert our selection to select everything around the figure, and we're going to fill that with black. And again, you can watch those little white circles in her hair disappear. So now we've updated the mask to use the new refined selection that we just created. And if you're following along, this is definitely where you would want to stop and save your work. Okay, so now it's time to think about what kind of background you want to put behind this figure. Remember that we're still dealing with that JPEG bug. If you try to load one directly like I do, it will crash Photoshop. So you either have to copy and paste from Google Images, or open Paint and convert your JPEG into a bitmap or a PNG file, which you can then open. If you do open it, it's going to appear as a separate file. So you have to go to the arrow tool there, click and drag it, to drag your cursor onto the other file, and then back into the middle and let go, and that's how you move it to the one that you want. So you can take the corners and resize it as needed. Don't stretch it. Make sure you're grabbing from the corners to keep the proportion correct. I'm leaving a little bit of a gap at the top, but we'll crop that out in a moment. Grab the layer and pull it down behind your figure so that you can see her. And there she is. Now there's a little bit of space at the top there because this wasn't quite large enough to fill everything. So we're going to go to the crop tool, and that'll put a grid on there. Stretch that so that it keeps all of the picture you want to keep inside the frame. So just the transparent part at the top is outside the frame. And then when you have it the way that you want, you select and it'll crop so that that frame becomes the new edge, basically, of your image. So now we have her in our new background. And because she's on a separate layer, you can select that layer and actually move her around. So highlight her layer, and you click and drag with the arrow tool, and you can actually move her to a place that, that seems to suit the background. So we're probably about halfway through the process now. We have our figure cut out, but you can see that she doesn't really look like she belongs in this scene. And part of the reason is because our colors in the background are very, very muted, and she is much brighter, and the colors on her shirt and skin are more saturated. So we're going to adjust her a little bit, and we're going to do that by going up to the top, going to create a new fill or adjustment layer. Click on that and go down to the hue saturation option. Now if you notice, a new layer has been created, and this is an adjustment layer, so it's going to adjust things below according to these three sliders. So if we move the lightness slider up, you can see everything gets light. Move it to the left, everything gets darker, which is a little bit of a problem actually, because we don't want everything to change, we just want her to change. So if we click this little box down in the corner, that will limit the changes only to her. So now you can see we can make her quite dark or quite bright, and we're not changing the background. So now we're going to start moving these sliders to try to make her fit into the background more. So for example, we're going to darken her a bit because the background's quite dark. The saturation slider determines how intense the colors are. So we're going to lower that quite a bit because the background colors are not intense at all. Now the hue slider can change color, but the problem is that we don't really want to change the color of everything, because we don't want to change the color of her skin. But you can select individual colors. Instead of being on master, you can select a specific color like blue, which affects her shirt. Her shirt is primarily blue. So if you move the hue slider now, it'll only affect the parts of her that are blue. So we can shift the blue shirt a little bit more into the green spectrum, since there's a lot of green in the picture. That can help make her look like she belongs. Now instead of choosing a color directly from the list, you can click on the eyedropper tool and then click on the exact color you want to change. So now I've selected her bedroll, which is kind of a cyan color, and now I can shift that, make it a little greenish, and really desaturate it so that it doesn't draw any attention to itself. She's starting to look a lot more natural now as part of this picture. And the good news is that this is all non-destructive. So if I hide that layer, she's still the same way that she was before. We haven't actually changed anything. So you can quickly turn that layer on and off to compare, and if you ever needed to, you could just totally delete it. Now this is pretty close to being done, but there's a couple other tools I'd like to show you how to use. First of all, you need to identify what direction the light's coming from in your background. So the top of the T-Rex is lit. The bottom is in shadow, and you can see on the leg that the left is more lit than the right, so our light direction seems to be coming like that. So we want to match that on our figure as well, and luckily it seems like the light is coming from that direction, at least in part. There's a few things you can do if it's not, however. If you go to the Burn and Dodge tool here and select the Dodge tool, which looks like a magnifying glass, this will actually lighten things as you paint on them. If you set it to lighten highlights, which I think is the default, it will look for areas that are already a little bright and only lighten those. Now make sure that your actual image is selected now, not the mask. So the blue outline should be around your image. And you notice as you paint over her hair, all the light hair is getting lighter, but it's not changing the dark areas very much. Now if you switch that to midtones and paint over it, then it would start to change a lot more. It will change the things in between. And if you set it to shadows, it'll affect the darker areas or darkest areas. The more you paint over an area, the lighter it gets. So we want to go back to painting on highlights, and we're just going to brush over the edge of her hair so that we're lightening up the areas where the light would hit. And we'll do the same thing on her arms or anywhere where it looks like the light should be hitting that direction a little more than it is. I don't think we have to do too much because she's already lit fairly well from that side. Maybe a little bit on the shoulder here. This is somewhere where you really have to just use your judgment about where it needs more light. Maybe I'll put a little bit on this bedroll too. And then we're going to switch to the little hand icon there, the dodge tool. And this works the same way, except it darkens things. So we're going to start out by darkening the shadow areas. And so we'll darken along the edge of her arm, where a little bit of shadow should be cast. And we want to do this subtly. Remember, if you go over the area too many times, it'll start getting too dark. And if it gets too dark, if she has more contrast on her than anything else in the picture, that will start to make it look like she doesn't belong. So we want to keep this subtle. Put a little bit on this side of the legs there. And if there isn't any shadow in an area, so nothing is happening when you go over it, you can switch to midtones, which will give you a greater range to darken. You just want to make sure you don't overdo it. Now when I zoom out here, I actually feel like I have added a little bit too much contrast to her skin now. So I'm actually going to go back to our adjustment layer, and if I double click on that layer, it will bring up the adjustment window again. And I'm going to select her skin, select the color of her skin. So first I've got to select a particular color to get the eyedropper tool to show up. And then I'm going to click on her skin, and I'm going to actually desaturate it a little bit, take some of the color out, and brighten it just a bit. There, so this may not be a perfect job, but I think now she looks like she really belongs in that picture, or at least she doesn't stand out like a sore thumb. So now you're going to be taking these same techniques and trying them on your own with a picture of your choice.